You might not have heard of the Ukrainian Azov Brigade. The fighting unit was formed of volunteers in 2014. In the beginning, it was led by Andrei Beletsky, who has said it is Ukraine's national purpose to, quote, lead the white races of the world in a final crusade against Semite-led Untermensch, end quote. Untermensch means underclass, inferior people. The Azov Brigade is the product of Nazi ideology, and it's no secret. Nazi ideology that was and remains an undeniable problem for Ukraine. As recently as 2018, the United States Congress ordered that none of its aid was to be used to, quote, provide arms, training or other assistance to the Azov battalion. But last week, pictures circulated of former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson in what appeared to be a room in a private members' club in London, praising the brigade's members as heroes. This was, let's not forget, the same Boris Johnson who was the NATO bag carrier sent in 2022 to scupper the potential peace deal between Ukraine and Russia, thereby helping consign uncounted tens of thousands to the meat grinder since then. Johnson posed with the brigade's flag, told his guests and his audience, "My message to you is very simple. Thank you to the heroes from the Azov Brigade who honour us with their presence tonight." He took the opportunity to demand on behalf of Ukraine the right to fire Western-made weapons deep into Russian territory, a move that threatens the final descent into World War III, which is a hot war with Russia. In the upended, upside-down world in which we are living, it can be hard to remember what we were once invited to know as the truth. For example, I'm sure I remember at school being taught that the Allies, Britain, France, Russia, the United States of America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and more besides, won the Second World War by defeating a bunch calling themselves Nazis. I was also definitely taught that Britain went to war with Nazi Germany with the intention of restoring freedom and democracy to those who had been denied them by the Nazis, and that by 1945 this objective had been achieved specifically by defeating those Nazis. Of course, even a cursory examination of the events that unfolded during World War II reveals it was all, to be fair, a bit more nuanced than that, to put it mildly. When Britain declared war on Nazi Germany, the stated intention had been about restoring freedom and democracy, specifically to Poland and the Poles who had been invaded by Nazis. When I say the playing out of events was nuanced, I mean, for example, that you don't have to be much of a student of history to notice that when the war ended, Poland and the Poles were completely abandoned to be eaten alive by the Soviet. No freedom restored for them, nor democracy either. But that's international diplomacy and geopolitics for you, or to put it another way, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. All of that said, I'm still sure I remember being taught that the Allies won the Second World War and that those nasty Nazis, the enemy of all that is good, were definitely defeated by us. The Nazis, I was taught, were the baddest baddies of World War II. The very sight of their famous logo, being the swastika, was supposed to strike terror into freedom-loving hearts forever, its meaning never to be forgotten. There were other insignia besides, all beyond the pale. Never again, I'm sure I remember that slogan as well, and being urged to make all efforts to ensure nothing like Nazism and its attendant horrors could ever return to stalk the planet. Ukrainians suffered horrors in the 20th century, before, during and after World War II, that are almost unimaginable. Under Stalin, they knew the Great Ukrainian Famine, also called the Holodomor of 1932 and 1933, which killed perhaps 5 million people. Under Nazi occupation during the war, there was more suffering. More than 1 million were murdered as part of the Holocaust. Jews, gypsies, political opponents, any and all deemed undesirable. Untermenschen. At Baba Yar, a ravine near the capital city of Kiev, tens of thousands of men, women and children were ordered to strip naked before being herded into mass graves and machine-gunned to death. Some Ukrainians sided with Nazis, others sided with Russians. And then the second half of the 20th century happened, right up to and including the decades since 1989, when NATO ignored all of Russia's red lines until it was 1,000 miles closer to the bear. Then a US-enabled coup in 2014, the chasing out of Kiev of a democratically elected president disliked by Washington and favoured by Moscow, a Ukrainian civil war in which those with affiliation to Russia were the targets of sectarian violence, estimates of 10,000 dead in the last decade in the east of Ukraine, killed by explosives dropped on them by those in the west of that country. Always the push to pull Ukraine, Russia's stated buffer against NATO, into NATO and even the European Union. And then in September last year, I watched in real life, in real time, a Ukrainian Nazi veteran of that war, of World War II, being treated to a standing ovation in the Canadian Parliament, while Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau grinned and clapped along with every other parliamentarian in the room, and while President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine raised a clenched fist in salute, 98-year-old Yaroslav Hunka was bathed in the adoration of all assembled. Hunka had been introduced to the throng as a Canadian war hero who had, and here's where the world turned upside down, fought the Russians during World War II. Remember, insomuch as history matters, the Russians during some of the 1940s at least were our allies. Old man Hunka, as it turned out, had been a member of the Waffen-SS Galicia Division, or the SS 14th Waffen Division, a Ukrainian volunteer unit under the command of those that slaughtered the tens or the hundreds of thousands at Baba Yar, those I had been taught to understand as the baddies, those Nazis. The Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Centre for Holocaust Studies said that Hunka's division, quote, was responsible for the mass murder of civilians with a level of brutality and malice that is unimaginable, close quote. So, as I said, an upside-down world, a world in which the truth is turned on its head or turned inside out or otherwise perverted. In recent years, statues have been raised in Ukraine and in Canada, as it happens, to which many Nazis fled after the war, to honour some of those Ukrainians who, during that war, served the Nazi regime. Some Ukrainian streets are named for Nazi proxies too. To this day, Ukraine, and therefore the Ukrainian army, has an undeniable Nazi problem, the Azov Brigade, now part of the Ukraine National Guard, being part of it. And so I ask myself, exactly where are we with Nazis? Did fathers and grandfathers of ours fight and die to defeat Nazis or not? While we're at it, let's not forget Operation Paperclip, when at the end of the war the United States decided there were Nazi scientists and intellectuals in Germany in possession of knowledge and skills that outweighed, as far as the US administration was concerned, any crimes they may have committed. By this means did an unknown number of Nazi scientists and thinkers enter the US, placed quietly into academia, research institutions, and into every other walk of American life, so that a lifetime later a person might justifiably ask, was World War II, in which the fathers and grandfathers died, really about defeating Nazis and Nazism at all? Before Hitler and his Nazis finally became too toxic even for them, all manner of the British elite were enthusiastic supporters of his particular brand of fascism. The elite has a guiding mission after all. It's about purity of blood and preserving lineages, which just happens to have been the defining obsession of Adolf Hitler and his Aryans. A handful born to rule and billions of pesky, unwanted Untermensch cluttering up the joint, consuming resources and otherwise spoiling the view. Only the most famous or infamous is Oswald Mosley, 6th Baronet, leader of the British Union of Fascists, with a family line all the way back to the 12th century. His first wedding to Lady Cynthia Curzon in 1920 was attended by the King and Queen. His second wife was Lady Diana Mitford, daughter of another baron and dedicated fascist. Diana's sister was Unity Valkyrie Mitford, who joined the British delegation at the Nuremberg Rally in 1933 and was described by those that knew her as, quote, more Nazi than the Nazis. Lift the carpet, listen beyond the rhetoric, and hardly a staple of the British establishment is found clean of the fingerprints of fascism. From the 16th century plantation of Ireland to the slavery and segregation of the American colonies and onwards to opposition to universal suffrage and the rest of troublesome democracy, the self-proclaimed elites have always fought to keep the lower orders, which is all of us, firmly under their boot heels. The theft of the very land itself, by means of enclosure from the 13th century onwards, meant that by the time of the First World War, 4/5 of the UK was in the possession of the aristocracy. Bill Gates and his greedy acquisition of more than 250,000 acres of US farmland and the World Economic Forum-driven grab for the farmland of Europe is just the latest iteration of the same old determination to rip the good stuff from the hands of the many and to centralise it in the grip of the very, very few. Millions like me were raised to believe the Allies fought the Nazis and won. The people like you and me, acted in good faith and then kept the faith. Never again we learned to cry. Never again. But I watched the footage of Johnson in London and I wondered just what really happened. Who won and who lost? What have we really learned? What are we supposed to think of the agonies of the 20th century? What were they suffered for? Here's the thing. There can be no doubt that the people of Britain, like other peoples around the West and the world, were told their forebears fought and died to defeat Nazism and Nazis. How are we, the people of this country, of the West, even to know which way is up? If an organisation in direct line of descent from Nazis is being celebrated in London within living memory of the days when Johnson's hero, Winston Churchill, railed against Nazism, just who are the good guys? And just who were the bad guys? Let's bring in Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford, defence analyst, author, writer and broadcaster. Stuart Crawford, what is your assessment of that footage of Boris Johnson in those circumstances?
The Azov Brigade, as it now is, has undeniably neo-Nazi and Nazi affiliations in the past. It was, as you probably know, raised as a sort of militia in the Donetsk Oblast to resist the illegal Russian invasion back in 2014. And of course, they were unsuccessful in resisting the Russian invasion. But I think it was in 2017, the Azov Brigade was incorporated into the National Guard of Ukraine. So it became part of mainstream Ukrainian armed forces. And since then, there have been considerable efforts to distance itself from its origins. And of course, the one incident or the one event in which they played a major part was the siege of Mariupol, where they retreated into the steelworks and kept the Russians out for a considerable period of time against, it has to be said, overwhelming odds before the Ukrainian government told them to surrender. So I think that we have to place it in the context of how that organization has developed. I'm not making any pleas for them. I'm not carrying a flag for them, no pun intended. But I think that the affiliations with neo-Nazism and Nazism are in the past. And certainly, of course, Boris Johnson is not a neo-Nazi, nor would he support any organisation which had such ideology.
I'll leave that there for the moment.